South of the continent in Zimbabwe, voters head to the polls on July the 30th to elect a new president and members of both houses of parliament. President Emerson Mnangagwa, who came to power after a de facto coup in November that forced out Robert Mugabe, hopes the vote will be recognized as free and fair and end Zimbabwe's isolation by Western powers. But supporters of the main opposition, Movement for Democratic Change, are demanding electoral reforms that are vital for a credible vote. They also accuse Mnangagwa's government of deploying soldiers in the countryside to intimidate voters and campaign for the ruling ZANU-PF party. Now, for more insight on Zimbabwe's politics, I am joined by Leon Hartwell, political analyst who has written extensively on Zimbabwe's politics. Welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you very much, Vincent.
So first, in your observation, looking forward, do you see this upcoming election, being so uniquely different than what we've seen in the past when Mugabe went to the polls alongside or on the opposite side of Mr. The leader of the MDC at that time?
The short answer is yes and no. Yes, there are some differences because for the first time, ZANU-PF has a candidate who is now 20 years younger than the previous one. He's still fairly old. He's in his 70s, but he's much younger than what President Robert Mugabe was. And then in terms of the main opposition party, the MDC-T is now led by Nelson Chamisa. And Nelson Chamisa is also a young candidate. Some say he's quite vibrant and so on. So there are some changes in terms of the leadership. But in terms of why I also said no, there are some similarities. The parties are still the same. These institutions did not change overnight. ZANU-PF is still ZANU-PF. What we saw in terms of the coup at the end of last year in November, it was a continuation of the old guard. It was trying to maintain those interests rather than to affect regime change as such.
Now, in terms of and we saw this a few weekends ago when there was an explosion at the rally there. Is ZANU-PF together? I mean, are we looking at a party that may go to the polls splintered?
Yeah. That's a good question. On the one hand, when Mnangagwa came into power, you have to understand what happens at the top is very important. And we haven't seen the rise of two open factions underneath Mnangagwa, or even just one faction, against Mnangagwa. But at the same time, yes, the bombing might suggest there might be some issues related to factionalism, but I think that could be contained up until the elections at the very least. What you have to remember is when the military coup took place, there were some individuals within, notably the police and the Central Intelligence Organization in Zimbabwe, who were not completely on board with the military coup. So I think it relates to those issues.
So let's talk about the opposition and MDC. To what extent do you see it ready for the upcoming election? Of course, they've complained about intimidation, especially in the countryside, and electoral laws that don't favor them.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest issues with regards to the MDC at the moment is just the internal factionalism. I think it's much worse than what it is within ZANU-PF. There are basically two leaders, Nelson Chamisa and then Thokozani Kupe, who are claiming to be the real leaders of the MDC-T that they claim they inherited from Morgan Tsvangirai. That's a huge weakness because in Zimbabwe, you have to kind of take the approach of my enemy's enemy, otherwise you will lose together. Also, I think there are a lot of organizational issues that they have to confront within the party. Nelson Chamisa is also a very young individual, and they say he can bring the young voters to the table. But at the same time, will he have the rural vote? And that's a big question mark.
We don't want to talk ill of the departed, but what do you think was the major mistake that Mr. Tsvangirai, the late Tsvangirai, made, which would have been different if he had probably organized the party differently?
I think one of the big issues was leadership, and under that umbrella of leadership, you can identify a whole range of issues. from, there were issues with regards to a democratic deficit, financial issues within the party, a lack of respect for human rights, and so on. What you have to remember is that Zimbabweans don't want ZANU-PF light. They want a clear alternative to ZANU-PF. And so when you field a party during election time, I think a lot of Zimbabweans say, well, we want something different, a party that would be stand for democracy, for human rights, and so on.
We may have to call you back so we talk a bit more about this
Thank you,
before the
Vincent.
election. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Well, that's Leon Hartwell joining us today to talk about Zimbabwe politics.